I'm just going to. So welcome everyone. I'm Mark Reed and I'm co-chair with Diana Kapansky of the UNEP Global Peatland Initiative Research Working Group. So great to see a number of familiar faces from the group and some new faces. And we're very fortunate today to have a number of prestigious speakers who are going to be following up from some of the discussions that happened in both COP26 and COP27 around cultural heritage and peatlands. A really important issue, some really important practical progress being made towards protecting cultural heritage in peatlands, and looking forward to finding out more. So Rosie, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. It is really nice to see so many faces, and as Mark said, new and familiar faces too. So yes, as Mark has said, this is a progress point really for us as cultural heritage practitioners and academics. This has been more than COP26 and COP27 length of work. There are people in this room who will be speaking today who've been working on this for I daren't admit how many years, that will show age, but it's great to have everybody here. And really today's session is to show how far we've come as cultural heritage academics and practitioners in the peatland restoration process, and really what to expect for the future. So we've lined up some great speakers today, not just from the UK, but also from our continental partners, and to speak through really what's happening on the ground in peatland restoration. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Geary, and he will talk through speakers. Thank you ever so much, everybody, and I really hope you enjoy it.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I hope you can all hear me. It's the usual, yes, and a few nods, so that's brilliant. Okay, so as Rosie says, we're gonna move straight on with this. Really, we're going to try and keep the session to an hour. There's a lot more we could talk about, but this is really a starting point to progress some of the conversations and hopefully open this network up and get a bit more integration going with between practitioners, academics, other institutions and bodies who are involved in peatland restoration. So as Ray says, we've got 4 speakers. They're going to speak for quite brief periods of time, maybe around 10 minutes each. So what really I'm just going to do is I'm just going to introduce the speaker and hand you straight over to that person. We'll have the 4 talks, and then there'll be an opportunity for some questions and a bit of discussion at the end. So brilliant. Without further ado, so first up we have Professor Ralph Fife. He's from the University of Plymouth in beautiful southwest England. Ralph will be talking about integrating the historic environment into peatland restoration, successes from southwest England. So Professor Fife, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Rosie, as well, for the invitation to speak today. So I'll just start a watch going so I can make sure I don't run over time. So I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about what I see as a really pioneering approach to integrating the historic environment and cultural heritage into peatland restoration practices. So I'm going to talk about the experiences in southwest England within this. So if I start just with a brief timeline of the peatland restoration schemes which have run within southwest England. So they started in 1998 as a set of pilot restoration works within Exmoor National Park. And this pilot work was led by the Environment Agency with partners in Natural England and Exmoor National Park Authority. And the focus was very much on water quality and managing downstream water flow. And it was extraordinarily small scale, kind of single site intervention with monitoring over a period of time. In 2006, this was upscaled and became the Exmoor Mire Restoration Project. And it was joined, the 3 partners were joined by South West Water as a very important delivery partner in this project. South West Water are the regional water company. And unlike some other regions, they're so predominant in the southwest. There are very few other water providers. And at that point in time, or slightly after the Exmoor Mire Restoration Project began, Historic England also joined the steering group. And the program is still relatively modest in scale. The ambition was to restore around about 300 hectares of peatlands back in 2006. The project then evolved and grew and obtained funding, which had funding through South West Water, almost £4 million, as part of the five-year process of identifying water charging rates for customers. So Ofwat allowed South West Water to invest £4 million of customer money into peatland restoration projects. And Dartmoor joined Exmoor as a series of pilot projects, and Exmoor kind of scaled up in order to sort of hit a lot more of that kind of landscape. And at this point, the focus became ensuring hydrological integrity of peatlands and starting to think a little bit about carbon sequestration and storage as well. More partners then joined in 2018, and this became a large-scale DEFRA-funded project, the Three Moors project, and at that point Bodmin also joined Dartmoor and Exmoor. And then in 2021, Natural England granted £9 million to the South West Peatlands Partnership, and project partners, all of whose logos are on here, also committed some match funding to generate a £13 million South West Peatland Partnership project, which extended then even further west down into West Penwith, which is down on the big toe of Cornwall, down on the far west of the UK. And so throughout this process, the work has been supported on the hydrological side by the University of Exeter, the team of Richard Brazier, Karen Anderson with the remote sensing side of stuff, and the University of Plymouth looking more on the ecological and palaeoecological and historic environment piece. So if I think about how this historic environment's been integrated into these projects, when the Exmoor My Restoration project started in 2006, the importance of the historic environment was recognised, but wasn't resourced within the project, which meant that Exmoor National Park or other actors, including Historic England, were resourcing and funding the works to mitigate the historic environment within these programmes. And so the main things which were being done were walkover surveys and targeted paleoenvironmental sampling and assessments of the active restoration sites at that time. If I think what deliberate actions were taken, Exmoor National Park reviewed their what were called areas of exceptional archaeological and historic importance, and they became known as premier archaeological landscapes. And at that point, they commissioned some walkover survey to identify paleoenvironmental sequences and integrate that paleoenvironmental potential into their definition of archaeological and historic value. They funded a PhD student, match funded a PhD studentship at the University of Plymouth to look at the preservation potential, threats, and value of the peatland resource as well. So in 2010, at the end of that Exmoor My Restoration project, there was an independent review undertaken which recommended, amongst lots of other things, greater strategic inclusion of the historic environment. What this meant was, from 2011, there was a dedicated project historic environment officer funded by the projects who had a responsibility for managing the watching briefs, desk-based survey, and commissioning additional research. And the Exmoor National Park Authority produced a historic environment for peatland restoration as well. And the Mars and the Moor project had an explicit objective to protect and enhance the historic environment, including preservation of paleoenvironmental deposits and better knowledge of the historic environment. And so these were the historic environment objectives at that time: to mitigate impacts on the historic environment by the project, to enhance knowledge and understanding of the historic environment, to improve preservation conditions and knowledge of the paleoenvironmental resource, and to develop an evidence basis to inform future decisions and method development. So what we have here is my colleague Jessie Woodbridge. We're extracting here a 6-metre long core from peat on Dartmoor, which gave us an 8,500 year long record, continuous record for the first time from the upland. And the map is mapping of peat cutting and peat drainage from LIDAR work undertaken by an independent consultant, Phil Newman. We scroll this forward, the current South West Peatland Partnership mission statement, which I've copied across here, is to support wildlife, store carbon, manage flooding, improve water quality, enhance the historic environment, and champion livelihoods. So it's explicit within the mission statement. And the Southwest Peatland Partnership currently employs 3 historic environment officers full-time, and that there are 18 members of the project delivery team. So almost a fifth of the project delivery team are historic environment officers. Martin with responsibility for Dartmoor, Joanna for the sites in Cornwall, that's Bodmin and West Benwith, and Phil is responsible for Exmoor. So what does this look like? This looks like multi-actor project management boards and advisory committees. So I sit on the Dartmoor Delivery Board along with commoners, the RSBB, Natural England, Environment Agency, etc. Ring-fence funding in the projects for historic environment work, staffing and mitigation, co-designing of restoration schemes, programs of commissioned historic and environment work, which are not just site focused, but are thematic in particular, and also incorporating the historic environment into measures of restoration success. So one of the things I'd emphasize within this process that's been incredibly important is to recognize that our other actors and stakeholders in peatland projects are not archaeologists, they're not cultural heritage managers. In the same way that we are not specialists in their disciplines, they're not specialists in ours. So we've worked carefully to educate and share our knowledge in a respectful way, so that they understand that peatlands are not sort of barren upland landscapes and tabula rasa to be explored and developed. And Lee Bray, who is one of the first project officers, produced a very nice hardback book which summarizes the historic environment works. I've even got a hard copy in my hand, which is very accessible and kind of clearly outlines the value and the successes of those early projects. I mentioned thematic surveys as well as site-specific surveys. So one of the things that was done very early on is to ensure that people recognize that some of the damage features which restoration projects are seeking to resolve are actually very much a part of the historic environment record and the cultural heritage of our uplands. So an extensive survey by Phil Newman, which drew on both earthwork survey, but also a lot of documentary archival material describing the historical value and uses of Peatland Dartmoor, and a similar project by Hazel Riley on Exmoor. And my final slide is that there are still areas of the work that we do which might be better exploited or realized by our other actors, our collaborative partners in these projects. So we have a lot of disciplinary value that we can kind of offer and take across. And I just put up one data slide, which is an example of a site I recently worked on Bodmin Moor, in which we calculated carbon accumulation rates in the peatlands. We looked at the sort of ecological characteristics of those peatlands, and we can demonstrate to the communities who are interested in carbon sequestration and storage that in fact historical actions improve the performance of some of these peatland systems, and they're not functioning in the way they did historically, but they are functioning in an improved way in terms of things like carbon sequestration and storage. So the amount of carbon being stored in this particular peatland, it's a valley mire system, increased sort of fourfold as a consequence of historical degradation of the upland. So that's just where I want to stop for today. And a whole bunch of people have kind of helped and supported this work. This is a photograph from about 3 weeks ago. We're working on carbon sequestration and storage on Dartmoor, as well as the long-term palaeoarchive. My colleague Laura Scoble, who's helping me on that. Thank you. I shall stop sharing and pass over.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ralph. That's absolutely fantastic. That's a really good start, and it shows, as Ralph said at the beginning, the Exmoor Mars work has been absolutely trailblazing in some of this, in terms of demonstrating the potential of the historic environment in the broadest sense, the recursive nature of I think, working and data as well, and that's something I think we might come back to later on. So thanks, Ralph. As I say, there'll be chance for questions at the end of the session, but without further ado, we're going to move straight on to our next speaker, Kat Hopwood-Lewis. Are you there, Kat? Kat is there, I can see.
I am here.
Brilliant. So Kat works for Natural England, and again, as I think we're going to see, some of the progress and work that's been made through Natural England is in the last couple of years in particular is also really impressive and excellent. So Kat, I'll hand straight over to you. And Kat's title is Practical Approaches to Cultural Heritage in UK Peatland Restoration Programmes. Kat, you have the floor.
Hi everybody, just let me get my screens in order so I can see my notes. Oh, it's not going to do it, is it? So let's default to the paper version. So I'm not just speaking on behalf of Natural England today, I'm speaking on behalf of the UK Cultural Heritage Working Party on Cultural Heritage, and we are representatives mainly of heritage agencies and natural environment bodies across the devolved nations of the UK. So you can see some of our symbols here. In England, we've got Historic England, Natural England, and the National Trust represented. Obviously, National Trust being UK-wide. We have the Historic Environment Division of the Northern Irish Department of Communities, Historic Environment Scotland, and I note that another member of this group, Tom Gardner's in the audience today, and also we've got Cadw over in Wales as well. And most of our members don't work full time on peat restoration and have to combine that with their other historic environment duties. But our aim as a group is to facilitate a common approach to heritage and peatland restoration between the devolved nations that might have different legislation, such as in Scotland, or delivery mechanisms, because we will each have our own kind of grant schemes and that sort of work. So is it gonna, there we go. So that's some of our members. We also have Maybelline Gormley, who's not pictured here, from Northern Ireland. And interestingly, we also have a standing invitee who's from outside of the UK, and that is Margaret Keane in the Republic of Ireland. And that is intended to facilitate cross-border working, and I think that's really key here. We're at the Global Peatlands Initiative meeting, and it's clear that when we're talking about climate change and environment, that those issues are transnational, and so it's important not to get bogged down with national boundaries. Our approach as a group is really not to see the natural and cultural environment as separate things, but to recognise that the archaeological features and the palaeoecological archive are sort of dependent on and inextricably linked to the condition of the peat substrate that they exist on, within and under. So, and from the opposite side, coming from the natural environment perspective, that condition of the peat has often been altered by human habitation and activities, whether that's our activity in the past actually on the site or in the surrounding area, contributing to industrial pollution, acid rain, and so forth. And by respecting and understanding those historical changes and the impact that human activity has on the generation of the mire, we can help inform those future restoration methodologies. We can help bring communities on board by helping them understand the time depth of their landscapes, and we can really help to shape the future land management of those sites. So, brief overview of the peatlands, but again, it's really important to emphasize the variety amongst our different devolved nations. So, for example, in England, we look at peat above 30 centimetres as deep peat. In Scotland, due to the much vaster natural resource, they're looking at 0.5 metres as their definition of deep peat. So there is variation across the board. And there's also variation on the state of archaeological knowledge. So both within nations, so in areas where we've had pioneer peat projects, such as the Southwest Peatlands project that Ralph has just mentioned, or in Yorkshire, where we have another speaker who'll be speaking to us shortly. There's a long tradition of looking at the archaeology alongside the peat. In other areas, we have much less knowledge. And from country to country, this estimate of 22,500 cultural sites is really a bit of a finger in the air estimate. We know that that is an underestimate of what we think we have, particularly in Wales. And we're not just talking about discrete sites, we're also talking on a landscape scale. So the Norfolk Broads is one of our protected areas and national parks, and that is actually completely formed due to peat cutting. We have the importance of peat for preservation in the temperate climate that we have in the UK, where we don't get the preservation of organic remains in other areas. And so peat is really a key area of archaeological potential for us. And just to add again on the global perspective, that we have some transnational World Heritage sites, such as borders of the Roman Empire, and again some of those are in peat-bearing areas such as the north of England, and we have the St Just World Heritage Site on the Cornish tin mining landscape down in the southwest. So, and here's our condition data, and the condition is really poor of peatlands in the UK. Over 80% of peatlands are classed as degraded. The loss of peat here is outweighing its accumulation, and as such, it's a net emitter of CO2 equivalent. I think this equates to the entire, oh, haven't got the figure to me, I'll skip it. But fundamentally, our approach as the Peatlands Working Party is to say that peatland restoration with its appropriate checks and balances is a net positive for the historic environment, because as I've said, if the peat that supports the archaeology is in bad condition, the peatland heritage itself is under threat. So we argue that where restoration seeks to stabilise the peatlands that are already degrading, the archaeology is at risk of desiccation, of deflation, where the peat is sinking, and from erosion. And stopping this by stabilising the hydrology should, in the short term, help to ensure those heritage assets are preserved from collapse, and it gives them a better hydrological and geochemical basis for preservation. So although there are some caveats and some working methodologies that we need to deal with, in general, peatland restoration should be favourable, and that's reflected in recent written guidance. So we've come together as a group of experts, and the recent publication by Historic England, I think here is sort of seminal for the archaeological community to say in some settings doing nothing is a direct threat to the preservation of peatlands' historic environment features, and that reflects that global climate emergency that we are in. So if we move on here to how we actually do this, you know, I said in my title, practical approaches, I've waffled a little bit about theory here, but we have a significant grant-aided peatland restoration environment in the UK, but that varies. So permitted development in Scotland requires planning permission or other work in England and Wales. Northern Ireland doesn't yet have a grant scheme in place and is currently looking at and drawing lessons from the other grant schemes to see how they can incorporate historic environment into that. But UK-wide, because much of the driver for peatland restoration is the sale of carbon credits for climate offsetting, we've also come together as a group to input into the Peatland Code, which governs standards for carbon credit sale in the UK, and included heritage text in that to try and influence the treatment of heritage in peatland restoration projects outside of that grant-aided environment. So how do we do it? What do we actually encourage? We've come together, we've looked at commonalities of approaches across the whole of the UK and of Ireland as well. And really it comes down to early scoping, find out what you've got, know your archaeological potential as well as your known sites, and then integrate that into the design of your work. So Rafe spoke about the need to do co-design. That's not always possible under every regulatory regime, but if we can educate and understand each other's perspectives, then restoration designers can work out what kind of works are appropriate on sites or buffer them out where that's not possible. But ideally, we'd like to see works on the archaeology, preserving the archaeology rather than leaving islands of degraded peat and thus degrading archaeology behind. We're going to use mitigation hierarchies to minimize damage, so avoid where that's necessary, minimize damage, and then look at techniques pulled from development control and elsewhere, such as watching briefs. Limited trial excavation is something that I funded in the past to ensure that we know what's happening on the ground. really need to embed budget into this and make certain that grant schemes have budget to include this kind of mitigation, as well as species biodiversity mitigation, all the other things that we normally consider in a peatland restoration. And we need to capture that data about the historic environment as we go along, plug those data gaps, make certain that we are making things easier for ourselves in the future. So where do we go from where we are now? As I say, we've got these lessons learned from the early pioneer project. We've come up with an overarching approach to how we deal with things in the UK, but we need to further embed best practice into peatland restoration outside of these grant-aided environments. The heritage sector needs to understand peatland restoration. We get a situation sometimes where curatorial local authority archaeologists are nervous of techniques and see them unnecessarily as damaging without realising the ongoing damage that is happening to the archaeology if the degradation is not halted. Ralph spoke very fluently about the need for more palaeoecological analysis and understanding of the archive of climate change and biodiversity within the peat. Natural England has just started a project on data sharing for peat, where we are looking at common metadata standards to help share peat data amongst projects, and hopefully that can go much wider, and so we can start to compare each other's data a lot more easily. We don't really understand site monitoring. There's a brilliant Historic England article publication called The Preservation of Archaeological Remains that talks about re-wetting and waterlogged remains, but it does focus on an urban context. What happens after we've re-wet a site in terms of archaeological preservation? We do need to understand that better, and then we need to engage with the community and help them to understand a better time depth. The peatlands haven't always looked like this. They haven't been barren, they haven't been dry, they haven't been bare. When we look from a global context, we see communities outside the UK much more engaged with their peatlands. They forage in them, they do recreation in them. In the UK, other than a few walkers and bird watchers, that isn't a space that people feel comfortable being in. What can we do to learn from other countries and share those lessons? And finally, we really need to understand how cultural heritage contributes to climate change mitigation. So these are some things we've done, projects that we've created. We have, each country has got its national peatland plan, with the Northern Irish one still to be signed off. We have started to generate written and video guidance, and some of that is shared. So you can see here, this document is shared guidance between Historic England as the statutory responsible body for heritage in England, and Natural England, who look after the environment and the landscape aspects. So starting to pull those two sides together. We've got some video guidance. We've got the Peatland Code text. We've got individual websites, manuals and webinars for our websites, which we're sharing and which are available. Contact me, I can send you all sorts of links. And the peatland contractors themselves, we've got Emily Stewart Rayner on here from Yorkshire Peat Partnership. They have got some great fact sheets about techniques that can help archaeologists understand what that really means in terms of ground disturbance. But they've also got good content about other things, and I think that's really important. We're starting to see training courses coming through. I just had a meeting with Nature Scott talking about the Crichton Centre in Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway's, who are starting a training course for designers of peatland restoration, and we need to ensure that heritage is embedded in that. And then again, we've got academic journals and publications starting to come through. But the key for here, I think, is networks, because we're not saying that we've got it 100% sorted in the UK. This is a kind of evolving situation, and we need to learn from other temperate climates, other global colleagues. What do you do with your peat? What lessons can we learn about your heritage? So this network, I think, is going to be really interesting and important for everyone. That's me.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic, Kat. Really kind of building on what Ralph said. I think we can see kind of the progress that's been made and the challenges that we still face. It's brilliant.
Just try and unshare.
Yeah, there you go. Well,
That's
unsharing. It's the joy of the online presentation. Oh, there we go. That seems to have worked. Excellent. So without further ado, we'll move on to our next speaker, who Kat just mentioned. That's Emily Stewart-Rayner from the ever wonderful Yorkshire Peat Partnership based in the UK. And I think we're probably going to hear a bit more on the practical side of mitigation in terms of historic environments. So over to you, Emily. Peatland restoration, digging the dark stuff.
Morning, everyone. As mentioned, I work for the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, and these are some of the organisations that we work with. We're an umbrella organisation, but we're led by Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and we receive support from all of these individuals as well, organisations, sorry. We work within the Great North Bog Partnership, which is predominantly focusing within and our work predominantly focuses within the Yorkshire Dales, Nidderdale, and with some work in the North York Moors and the Forest of Bowland. We've delivered a remarkable 41,469 hectares of peat restoration work up to the end of March 2022, with obviously further work this year. And this is around 43% of the estimated 92,946 hectares of peatland in our operational area. So as you can see from this slide, we work at a huge landscape scale to deliver restoration across Yorkshire. So today I want to cover how archaeology is considered within restoration, identify the gaps in our current knowledge and practice, and how we might improve capacity, contingency, and planning for heritage and peatland restoration. So to start with, I want to look at the way YPP consider archaeology within the restoration process, and I'll set out how we currently work and who we work with to achieve this. So this slide just shows out our process that the restoration team uses to integrate archaeology into every step of the restoration process. The pre-restoration phase shows how we use desk-based assessments to pull together everything that's already known about a site to provide as much knowledge as possible before we even visit an area of peatland. For landowners already in agri-environmental schemes, we need to know what restrictions exist, which might dictate how work can take place on the ground. A landowner may already have management plans for heritage assets on their land, and a selected heritage inventory for Natural England or SHINE dataset, along with the historic farm environment records, also known as HEFRs, can help us understand and share data with other agencies throughout this key phase, whilst developing our restoration plans. These initial conversations can also be key in understanding the cultural heritage of a site from the perspective of the gamekeepers and land managers who have intimate knowledge of these landscapes on the ground. This pre-restoration phase is all about beginning to understand these complexities. The restoration officers work with the local planning authority or national park authorities covering the site area to enable the historic environment records to be checked for any recorded heritage features known within the boundaries. They do this by sending over a site boundary as the site boundary as a GIS layer, which narrows down the information to the area which we'll actually be considering for restoration. And you can see an example on the right-hand side there of one of the plans where they've been mapping some of the gullies and grips there. Each of the authorities that we work with has a very slightly different way of working and how they want the information communicated during this stage. So this has led to areas of miscommunication, and we've recently moved towards having a standardized form which helps to capture why decisions have been made during this phase. This helps the restoration officer understand why survey recommendations or opportunities to record further archaeology on the site have been made. It also allows us to communicate more easily with national teams when we come to applying for consents to work on the site. GIS site files are then sent back to the restoration team, and this creates a historic environment layer, which is included in the pre-restoration mapping of the site. Once consents are approved and funding is secured, contractors are tendered for and the restoration plan is finalised within the discovery phase. This helps us ground truth the desk-based assessments that have been undertaken and moves the site into being considered as shovel-ready for groundworks to take place. Many of the peatlands that we work on have been in private land ownership, are largely unresearched and are often inaccessible, and the walkover surveys can uncover previously unrecorded features. This additional information is added to what we already know about the site to create exclusion zones to protect vulnerable archaeological or paleo-environmental features or deposits. As we move into the restoration phase, where groundworks begin to take place, archaeological contractors may work with the peatland restoration contractors to undertake watching briefs. For example, where it's necessary to oversee where bare peat hags and slopes are being reprofiled, such as this image on the left, and in the creation of peat dams across existing grips and gullies, as demonstrated on the right. Watching briefs don't happen at every site with archaeology, and the use of exclusion zones around archaeological features is more commonly used to help contractors avoid where archaeology is known to exist. This slide demonstrates a site where the project area in grey, around the grips, which are the blue lines, overlapped areas where archaeological features are highlighted in orange. These areas are confirmed with the contractors before access onto the site with machinery. Access routes are adjusted accordingly, and the works are periodically checked through clerk of work inspections by our own peatland restoration officers. So moving on to identifying gaps in our current knowledge and practice, a major issue I've come across since starting my role is the language barriers that exist between conservationists and archaeologists, which can lead to misunderstandings about what legislative requirements need to be met as part of the restoration process. This can lead to works having to be stopped and additional funding to be found mid-project. Improving this communication and understanding can help us overcome these pinch points during the project delivery. Comprehensive review of current data sets, bring together the information that we've already got over the last 10 years of surveying so that we actually understand what the archaeological record looks like and where future investigations could improve our understanding. Monitoring the impact of restoration works on archaeological preservation. In the last year, our own research evidence, data and development team has doubled in size, but we've increased the monitoring we undertake on our sites, both with our own teams, but also through citizen science programs, such as Eyes on the Bog. And we're constantly reviewing how we collect data, the tools we use to monitor changes in hydrology, vegetation, and emissions, as well as comparing the success of different interventions we've used on the site. But at present, this doesn't include looking at the effects of restoration on archaeology. Access, cultural value, and social histories. Our communication engagements team has also expanded in the last year. Keeping our work connected and relevant to the communities we interact with is vital to the future of these landscapes. If we're to improve accessibility of peatlands for public enjoyment and education, while also continuing to contribute to the landscape character of these places, we need to have a baseline understanding of how these places are currently used, valued, and understood. With the scale at which we're working and the need to work at speed to meet the changing demands of climate change, securing funding is a major part of making this happen. Having only a small window of opportunity to work on a site with restrictions in place during bird nesting and then often needing to be off-site during the shooting season, we can only, on some of the sites, we can only have access between December through to March. So this causes massive backlogs of work which take place during months most likely to be affected by the adverse weather that we can get up here, which can create an additional pressure for the contractors that we work with. By condensing groundworks into these short timeframes, this inevitably means periods which don't always match up with when funding is available to be spent, so that this can also create an administrative and financial pressure on the delivery for works on the ground. And finally, I just want to briefly cover how we might improve capacity, contingency and planning for heritage in peatland restoration. So resourcing, helping our restoration team understand potential costs, so that they can put this in within their tenders, and working with partners to build capacity with our contractors that we work with to help them understand how they access funding for machinery, materials and skill building. Retention of staff is also really important. The seasonal nature of the work means that contractors often lose staff over the summer months when there's less groundwork happening, but there is obviously potential for monitoring works. So this is something that we could look at. What can historic records tell us about past landscapes? So a recent community project that we've been working on has unearthed a visitor guide with these beautiful accounts of what the wildlife on the moors was like in the 18th century. And there might be further records which could aid our understanding, such as estate gamekeeper accounts and things like that. And so these would be great to look at as well. We're also looking at training to develop and promote skills building within the sector. So we've developed a LANTRA accredited course, which we're hoping will not only professionalise peatland practitioners' work in their own right, but also provide alternatives and skill building for rural workers. And this is clearly linked to promoting heritage careers within peatland restoration as a viable career opportunity. And finally, I just want to touch on the role of engagement projects in increasing capacity, such as I mentioned, with monitoring and bringing value to the work that we're doing and a voice for our peatland in the wider community. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of kind of what we do and how we do it. But yeah, happy to take questions later on. Thanks.
Absolutely fantastic, Emily. Again, I think what's coming through here is the fact that the historic environment in the broadest sense, it shouldn't be a barrier to peatland restoration, and also the importance of that integration at an early stage, and that's maybe something we'll return to later on. But thank you very much. That was brilliant. So we're moving now to our last talk, and we're moving away from England, Scotland and Ireland and moving on to continental Europe, where I think it's fair to say, and this is partly I think what we're hoping to achieve through this network, we have slightly less knowledge of perhaps how organisations in Europe and indeed elsewhere in the world are perhaps dealing with some of these problems. So that's something we can return to talk about. So next up we have Dr. Roy van Beek, who's from Wageningen. I'm going to try and pronounce that correctly, Roy. I don't know if I got that right.
Yeah, correct.
Is that correct? Excellent. Who's speaking on behalf of himself and his colleague, Dr. Maurice Poulsen, who I don't think can be with us today. Roy has worked in peatlands for quite some time now, and recently actually published a paper that you may have seen that got a lot of press about bog bodies. It made it was in the journal Antiquity, but it was picked up kind of all around the world. It made him something of a celebratory, I think, Roy. Anyway, so Roy is talking, again, a slight change of direction here, I think, but bridging natural and cultural heritage management, action perspectives for present and former raised bog areas in the Netherlands. So Roy, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Let's see if I can get this to work. There you go. Can you see me and hear me properly? Yeah, okay, thanks. Seems to be okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. I thought these first lectures were quite inspiring, and also made me realize that we in the Netherlands actually are very much still in the early scoping phase that Kat described. So what I'm telling here today is largely based on the work of indeed Maurice Poulsen, who did his PhD on the historical geography and landscape history of peatlands in the Netherlands. I supervised him and did some work with him on this, and so this is one of the papers that he wrote, and I'm largely based this presentation on that. So what I would now like to do is to give you a little bit of context about the Netherlands, because it is indeed quite different from what you see in the UK and in Ireland, which has mainly got to do with the reclamation history. So this is an image that I would like to start with. It's an image that's based on work by Wil Caspari. I think some of you may know his name. He's one of the most famous peatland researchers that we had in the Netherlands. He also worked in Ireland, and I think also in the UK at some point. And he created some nice overview maps of the original distribution of raised bog and fens in the Netherlands. So this indeed gives an idea of how omnipresent these landscapes actually were, or these ecosystems actually were at some point in the Netherlands, as I should say, because we have been really good in reclaiming these landscapes over time. Nowadays, we only have some 5% or maybe even less of these landscapes left. So that's pretty alarming, I should say. This is an image from the Drents Archief, the archive of Drenthe, which is the province of the Netherlands, where lots of peatland reclamations have happened in the past. And this is something that already started between the 10th and the 13th century, something that was actually started in Belgium, the whole technique of peat reclamation, and then it was extrapolated or also used in the Netherlands. And especially since the 16th and the 19th, maybe early 20th century, we have reclaimed almost all of the bogs that we had. Originally, first for agricultural purposes, but then for peat cutting, so for fuel, which was then mainly transported to the western parts of the country. So basically, that leaves us in many cases with landscapes like this. I think if you read archaeological literature about bogs in continental Europe, you will probably have seen the term or the name Bourtange Moor, in the Netherlands, Bourtange Veen, which is one of the most famous bogs that we have. It's actually in the Dutch-German border region. And I think we only a few percent of this originally huge bog are still there. And they generally, and the largest parts of this bog now look like this. So these are typically peat colonial landscapes. So those are the predominant landscapes that we still have left of this originally huge expanse of bogs in the Netherlands. So what Maurice and I were actually curious about is what type of cultural heritage is actually there in these bogs, but also in the vicinity of these bogs, in these reclamation landscapes, and how is that actually dealt with in nature management plans. So that's what we basically set out to do. So this is very much a first academic exercise, but with some ideas about how we can then use that in future management of these landscapes. So what we then saw is that we still have some 17 areas left that contain raised bogs, and almost all of those are part of the so-called Natura 2000 nature preservation framework. So basically you have these, what they call recovering bogs, which are, I'm not really sure how you would call it in English formally, but they actually have been degraded, but do still have the potential to become active bogs again. And then we have tiny areas where there still are active bogs. And these bogs, they vary from really small to quite huge, up to 2,500 hectares, including, for example, the Vochtelo Veen bog, which is the area where we did a lot of fieldwork in. Interesting, you see to the right here an image of one of the governmental organizations that say purely nature. It's a purely landscape. Well, I think we all know that this is basically not true, because it's an entanglement of all kinds of natural and cultural remains that we have. So what did we then set out to do? And I realize I have to be a bit quick in my description. So we wanted to take a look at both the raised bog remnants that we still have, but also the adjacent former boglands, so the peatland reclamation landscapes. And with regard to the stratigraphy or the focus of our work, we mainly looked at the so-called supra-peat cultural remains. We stole a division from Ben that he published in 2010, and I think it's also in his recent overview book of peatland archaeology, in which he makes a distinction between remains that are found below the peat, finds that can be done inside the peat sediments themselves, and also remains that are on top of them. So we mainly looked at that top layer, so what's still there and that's still visible today in the modern day landscape. Yeah, and then obviously we were also interested in that, nature culture dichotomy, as we called it. So there was hardly any work done yet, so we thought, how are we going to tackle this? So we created a pretty simple methodology to see what was basically there in these landscapes. So what we first set out to do was to make a list of all kinds of different finds that you could potentially do in and around these bog landscapes, just using all kinds of literature that was available. And then we actually tested that list to 3 bog areas that are depicted here in the right, which are including the more famous bogs that we still have in the Netherlands. And I will not go into detail because it's more about the methodology that I want to show you here now. So for these bogs, we made a timeline of the use history based on published literature. We had the luck that there was a recent overview study which gave very concisely an overview of the history of all the bogs that we still have in the Netherlands. It was mainly an ecological overview, but still they mentioned something about the use history of these areas. So then we created a GIS environment in which we included all kinds of data that we thought was useful, like a dam, aerial photographic maps, topographic maps, whatever we could find. And then we thought, okay, so this is going to be translated into a number of different zones in which you can have different cultural remains, or where we know that they are still present. So these, for example, include parcellation systems within the existing bog remnants, but also all kinds of cultural remains which are outside, which have got to do with the reclamation of these landscapes. We also looked at all kinds of sites which have a specific status, a legal status. So listed monuments on different types of levels. What we were very interested in but did not manage to do was to look at all kinds of local knowledge and local engagements with these bogs, because obviously we have all kinds of families who are still living there, which have a history of peat cutting, and of course that's very important to get a good sense of place and of the history of these areas. Something that we would like to include in the future, but that we did not manage within the framework of this specific research. Yeah, and then we combined all these data together to make a map and a narrative of what basically happened in these landscapes and what's still to be seen there in these areas. Now, obviously, the conclusion of this is not going to be very striking, at least not for this crowd that I'm speaking here now. There's all kinds of different cultural remains which are present there in these landscapes, and they have got to do with reclamation, but also with other types of use. So, for example, to the left we can see a pretty famous series of boundary markers, which were originally the boundary between the Netherlands and Germany. They're still there in one of these eastern Dutch bogs. We have turf factories, but also, for example, concentration camps dating from the Second World War, which were deliberately placed in the border zones of these wet and relatively remote landscapes in the Second World War. And that's just a very tiny selection of all kinds of special stuff which you cannot find anywhere else in the Netherlands. Well, just to summarize, this is a very nice quote, I think, from Abby Flint and Ben Jennings, who say these landscapes basically are saturated with meaning. So there are all kinds of feelings and histories and stories, and also tangible remains which are still there. And we need to think about what we are going to do with them. Well, and then the most alarming part basically is if you then look at the Natura 2000 management plans, which are made for these landscapes. I think the earliest generations are some 6-7 years old. there's hardly any mention of cultural heritage. And obviously that's more or less understandable because they are mainly written from an ecological perspective, but still it is alarming to see how little information is there about cultural remains and the history of these landscapes. So our conclusion basically is that there is no clear vision on the incorporation of cultural remains in bulk management in general in the Netherlands. So that's a completely different starting point compared to the stories that the first three speakers have given. Still, we think that there are all kinds of common grounds between archaeology, cultural history, landscape history, and nature restoration. There are all kinds of shared interests. For example, in having these bogs as wet as possible, which of course is also good for all kinds of organic archaeological remains that you would encounter there. We think that it's really important at this point that we should raise awareness about the presence of these cultural remains, because the nature managers basically have very little knowledge on it. What we actually use as a framework is the idea that humans are ecosystem engineers, just like peat mosses. So these landscapes, they obviously have got a very special natural history, and there are paleoenvironmental archives, like we heard with Ralph. But basically, humans have also contributed to the creation of the cultural landscape that's there today. And we would say indeed that local communities need to be involved far more. So now going to wrap up, and I think you'll probably get nervous time-wise. This is the last slide, and I realize that you probably cannot read this, but what we try to do in this first, almost pioneering type of study is to think, okay, how can we then incorporate these cultural remains in nature restoration schemes? So we thought we can make this nice overview in which we have more and less intensive management from an ecological point of view. And then you can think of how that basically would affect all kinds of different archaeological and cultural historical remains. Now, you cannot read this, so I will just refer you to the publication where it's in. So this is the PhD thesis of Maurice, which he published earlier this year, which he defended earlier this year, I should say. And I will also put the link in the chat. And there you can just take a look at it and see how we develop this whole story. So basically, it's a very different story from what you see in the UK and in Ireland, partly because we have actually wrecked most of our bogs in the last centuries. But this means that our challenge is slightly different, in which we have the remaining bogs all under quite strict protection. And then protection from an ecological point of view. So that's something that we need to think about. But in the vicinity of that, in the wider vicinity of that, we have all kinds of reclamation landscapes which contain different types of cultural remains. And we also need to think about those, because these are also really special and rare, and say something about the landscape history and the identity of these places. So this is very short, but maybe you can read a little bit more in Maurice's thesis about it. Thanks.
Fantastic, Roy. That was absolutely brilliant. A really nice kind of bookend to what we've heard so far. Now I'm conscious we're at an hour, but I don't think we want to hurry too much through this. So I think what we're going to do now is perhaps hand over to the audience. If anyone has any questions, then now is a good time to ask them. Alternatively, if you want to put a question in the thread, you're very welcome. Just while people are thinking about asking questions, maybe a couple of points. Roy mentioned links and other information. What we're going to do is we'll populate the GPI research group page with information about the speakers today and with the resources and so forth. So don't panic too much about it. If you want more information, we will make all of that available. I think just to say, really, Roy referenced the publication 2010, which was I think it's the IUCN document that Ralph was involved with, and I think maybe some other people in the room. I think what's remarkable is how far we've come in 10 years, and that partly is due to, I think, the IUCN, who's part of their Peatland reviews, commissioned with Historic England, who played a huge role in this, review of historic environments, and I think we've come a huge way in 10 years. There's still work to be done in different ways, but we've come a long way. And again, this is part of the hope of this group, is to really open this conversation now, bring different people into that, and really kind of help to embed historic environment into peatland restoration, and get a really, as I say, a recursive relationship there, because historic environment is not just something that prevents or should block, it's something that enables as well. And I think we've seen that in the talks today. So anyway, so I'll stop talking. If anyone does have any questions, I think you can probably put a hand up or throw something into the chat. So while I'll just carry on talking just to see if anyone is going to ask anything at all.
Chat as well too, Ben.
Okay. Anyone at all? So just pull that up. As I say, there's this is really the kind of the first round of this, I think, and we're hoping to develop this network. And particularly, we're really keen to speak to people outside the UK and Ireland, other groups. Ironically, our knowledge of peatland tangible heritage is very much restricted to countries where we've seen big interventions to peatlands, as we heard with Roy, which some places are led to complete destruction, and other places knowledge of what survives, and really the importance of protecting that resource. So we'd love to speak to and hear from groups from elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere in the world, really, to maybe bring in some of these questions. Sorry, Rosie.
Diana has a question.
Thanks so much, and to the whole group, and also to yourself, Ben and Rosie, for coordinating this. I wanted to ask what you feel is missing, maybe in some of the enabling environment, or some sort of cues that you think could, whether that's location specific or nation specific or across the community. What would, in your opinion, allow you to really reach wider, but also to get this, to really integrate into the peatlands restoration and protection work that's going on?
Can I answer that? Is that all right, Ben? Yep.
No, whoever wants to speak, I'm sure some of the speakers will also have angles on that, but Rosie, yeah.
So I've been making notes as we go through this, and I think across the board, all the speakers made this point, and I think that the challenge is knowledge. So actually knowing who is out there, who's doing this at a nation level. So, part of the reason that we know so much within the UK, Ireland, and the Netherlands is these are academic and practitioner contacts who've been working as a group for 10 years plus, building this knowledge base, and actually trying to get that outside of that geographical region has been a real struggle. And I think that's why we've really tried to hone this through people like yourselves, Diana and Mark, at the GPI, because it gives us that platform to reach out and find out knowledge bases across different nations. In terms of actually how we get this into a practical sense, again, Kat spoke about this, and Emily, around budgets, mitigation strategy, access to that data. And I think that what Ben and I would really like to develop as part of this, and actually hand it over to groups such as the GPI and working as a platform, is really getting that out there, that we can build cultural heritage mitigation strategies into restoration programs, which then feeds that concept of bringing in different budgetary restraints, and think about particularly around things like language barriers. So, what are we balancing between conservationists and archaeologists? So yeah, I think it's really about reaching out at the moment, which is why we're here. But I think I'll stop talking because there's a lot of people.
Sorry, no, that's fine. We've got a couple more comments. We've got actually some of our speakers. Let's start with Ralph. You had a comment?
Yeah, I did. Thanks. Responding to your question, the original question, I would say, gosh, things always come in threes, right? But the first is that there had been a tendency to focus on individual sites, which are targets of restoration action, And some of the early stuff that was done on Dartmoor actually moved towards landscape scale. So actually we did really big scale survey, 5 kilometre square blocks of peatland biomes, loads of work to assess the extent and scale of the peatland and understand its long-term development, so we could then start to be predictive about the age of the surfaces underneath peat. And I suspect, Roy, that's kind of the direction that some of the work's going on in the Netherlands. It's about understanding that peatland in the broader context and therefore its potential. So I would suggest that, and if we're going through a kind of a permitted development type approach, then that will focus very much on the site of intervention rather than the broader context. So sites don't sit in isolation. The second I would say is that, and you'll all laugh when I say it, it's relatively easy to stick in a GIS the things where we know things are. And the problem with peatlands is we don't know where a lot of stuff is. So it's this problem of kind of relatively easily measurable stuff. But what we're not measuring is the cultural values that society has or has had in the past, that sense of place, that connection that contemporary or even historic communities had with their landscapes. So there tends to have been, if I use old language, a sites and monuments focus and even a kind of a palaeoecological focus, but it's that broader place of the peatland within a social and cultural context. I just finished a 2-year project looking at reclamation, historic reclamation, using historical archives to really understand a lot of that kind of work, and a lot of that comes through, and how people connect and describe these places. So that's really hard. It's extraordinarily hard to capture. Oral histories, narratives, sort of folk art, all those things are probably really important for us, but we're not necessarily very good at the moment. And the third is still that continuing education piece, and I've heard some really great ideas and initiatives around that, but educating the other actors within restoration schemes of the value, the importance, but also the value that our information has. So those are probably 3 things which I think we probably still might work on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ralph. We've got Kat, and Kat, I think you've got a comment.
Yeah, so I had 2, but I think Ralph has covered one of them really well, which is about how we focused in this on the tangible heritage and the physical features, and that actually things go much wider than that. When you're in a grant-aided environment, particularly, there's an emphasis on trying to control costs and do provide value for money in the public goods that you are providing in the form of carbon capture, and so that does stop you exploring in a wider sense. And that's why a network that has people from the public sector, people from commercial, people from academia can go much wider perhaps. And the other strand that's missing here is artists and communities, and we see good projects like Bright Edge Deep up at the University of Glasgow, or the Place project in Cumbria. Again, sorry, UK examples, but they are exploring art, poetry, music, and how that connects us to peatlands. But that is a form of heritage in of itself. The other thing I like to pick up is almost a throwaway comment Emily made about language and translation. It is incredibly hard to communicate what archaeologists are interested in to natural environment people, because someone will give us the name of a type of bund or the name of an intervention that they're doing, and actually that doesn't mean anything to the majority of the heritage community. I'm deeply embedded in natural England. I've been there for 13 years, and that's the kind of fish that I swim with. But for most archaeologists, we want to know what are the chemical changes, the hydrological changes, what level of ground disturbance. And if we can start to describe techniques in those ways, like what is reprofiling? Oh, well, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to dig a shallow hole at an angle and change the angle of the soil. Suddenly archaeologists know what you're talking about, and then we are actually communicating. And at that point, we can create mitigation strategies and work with you and say whether it's a positive, a negative, but could be positive if we did it slightly differently. And so I've got this two-way conversation that I have about subtractive and additive techniques. Archaeologists get very disturbed about ground disturbance, about subtracting material, because if we don't know what's in that material, we might be taking something important away. If you start adding instead, so I've got some techniques where we revet surfaces with coir bags filled with soil and plant into it, and that also stops erosion. So these additive techniques where you, instead of creating an arc bund by digging a bund, we actually use coir logs and pin it to the surface. Those are all really light touch techniques on archaeology. So we can change that language away from, well, we want to stop you doing things, to we'd like to change the way you do it to something different. But they do have cost implications. And so if we can get that knowledge that Roy talked about of where things are, then we can start to pin down which areas do we need to do co-design on and change the way that we restore peat.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely can't agree with all of that. Emily, I think you've got a comment.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, picking up on both Ralph and Kat's points there. So just talking about the landscape scale and not looking at sites in isolation, I think something that's really key to that for us has been how we link the rural areas that we're working on with the urban areas that are really close by, which do have an intrinsic cultural heritage link to where we're working in the uplands. So for example, Bradford and areas like that where we've got textile mills link to our uplands where the wool has come from. So that's something that we're looking to explore, and also to understand if that's a way to get people interested in the landscapes that we're working on, that it's perhaps harder to make that link with the ecological lens on. And the other point I just wanted to make was, yeah, that we also do work quite closely with academics, but it's working on sites where we've got more freedom to kind of trial things that might not work. And again, it's linking to that point that Kat made about, you know, if we've got to prove value on a technique, we have to prove that it works. So actually having those spaces where we can trial different techniques and understand and monitor how effective they are will really help us. So yeah, just picking up on what you guys said really, but hopefully that adds a little bit more perspective from our side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm conscious we're kind of short of time, so we might tie up, but this is just the start of the conversation. I'm just going to make one point that has come up a couple of times there, and that is language. I think is really critical. I mean, even like the expression historic environment, which is I don't even know where that expression comes from, and we use it as archaeologists and historic environment specialists to talk about prehistory as well, and that's confusing. So that language is an issue there, and also as part of that, when we talk about heritage, cultural heritage, what we mean. So and a couple of people, Roy also talks about this intangible heritage. That's the other side of the coin, and I think we sometimes have an issue that these things are seen as separate, and they're not. They're really not separate, and we need to think of them really as integrated. In Ireland, there's been some very good work done on this by Kate Flood. I don't think Kate's in the room; she couldn't make it. She's done some excellent work with communities, looking at those associations with peatlands and boglands that are kind of embedded in the community. So I think that is a really important part of all this that we've not talked about so much today, but it is part of the conversation. Anyway, right, listen, look at that point. I think we'll look to tie up. Thank you so much to all the speakers. That was brilliant. Thank you to the audience, particularly those who are maybe on British Standard Time. It's only 10:15 here now. And anyone else from elsewhere in the world, I don't know what time it is with you. Thank you so much for coming along. As I said, we will put this recording will go up online, and other information will go up online. So watch this space. And as I also said, we're going to progress this conversation. Rosie, sorry, yes.
I'm just going to wrap this up before I hand over very quickly to Diana. This is just the beginning. You know, we've been working with Diana and Mark through the GPI slowly. I think they're a bit fed up of us knocking on their doors now. But now that we've opened up this network, we're really keen to keep this conversation going, and we do hope to put out something more formalized that really puts down some of the things that we've spoken about today, particularly about how we can integrate both the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of peatlands into broader peatland restoration programs. So thank you very much. So thank you so much, everyone, for speaking and for listening. And I'm going to pass over to Diana. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to you, and also thank you for that added insight. And you can see the sort of niche of everyone's different perspectives coming to bear on what those priority actions for their work would be. I just want to note that it is really about not feeling intimidated, not feeling shy, but to actually reach out across disciplines, across geographies, and really also across different languages. And that's really what we've been trying to do here as the Global Peatlands Initiative and this research working group, is really to create a space for everyone to connect up and learn from each other. But that also takes time. And I think that we're starting to, as people that are trying to tackle the nature, climate, and pollution emergency, realize that it's worth taking that time, because it will actually save you loads and loads of time in return. I shared a link here about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and some of the way that you can reach out and get your work more known is to actually put your restoration projects on a map. We've found that's extremely useful, and we've got a special drop-down category for peatlands restoration action. So really do maybe think about putting some of your work on that map, because it will then unlock interest and encourage others to reach out to you. We're always here for communities interested in peatlands, interested in impact, and interested in results for change. And besides, reaching in and reaching across, please do also join us. We have an upcoming research working group. It's completely open, and if you know others in your community that you would like to join, please do link them up with Mark or myself, and we'll let you know how to join. But the next meeting is on the 28th of September, 3 to 4 p.m. UK time. You can look on the Global Peatlands Initiative page and click on the research tab, as well as we're trying to get better at putting these things on our events calendar. But if you have other events, other moments, other content, please do reach out to us and share it. We can upload it also on our website in our resource places, but also on our virtual Peatland Pavilion. Is there anything else, Mark, that you wanted to share? Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today. Thanks, Mark, for also your stellar support and always great co-hosting skills. Thank you to all the speakers and also our few participants, but we will record this and play it on our YouTube channel, so that'll be available for all of you to share widely in your communities, because we do know sometimes the time doesn't work, everyone's super busy, but actually just spending this moment of time, an hour and 20 minutes together, is really going to help everyone in the long term. So closing off here from myself, Diana, Mark, and on behalf of also Ben and Rosie and all the speakers that shared their perspectives and their amazing work. Just enjoy your day, and we hope to see you at the next research working group.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.